Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and over the past few months I've been observing how a lot of little flying insects have been moving into some of my worm systems. So that's why I've got this bug zapper over here. That's why if you look at some of my trays, you can see I've got some diatomaceous earth sprinkled out onto the top surface of some of my systems. I mean, up here too, on top of this gas meter, I had set up one of these little traps that's got the apple cider vinegar in it. I never really saw too many bugs collecting in there. And most of my systems have some sort of countermeasures going on at this point, whether it's the diatomaceous earth, or maybe I've already started using this stuff here too, this mosquito dunks. So I'm still sort of trying to get to that point, that sweet spot, where I don't have to deal with flying insects in my worm bins. So today we're going to be checking in on one of my systems right here. 200-day-old African night crawler system. At least African night crawlers are what I was told that I'm getting when I got the cocoons that these hatched from. So I've never put any sort of, sprinkling of diatomaceous earth in here, nor have I ever applied any of that BTI or that mosquito dunks into here yet. But since I'm kind of phasing in the diatomaceous earth application, I might sprinkle some of that on top, although I don't see too many bugs here. Maybe we'll just get some of that liquid in here. And, at 200 days of age and having received 19 feedings so far, my idea was to give this thing maybe a 20th feeding and then maybe start into foraging. But whatever, we're going to get it up on the bench, sort of celebrate its 200-day birthday, and see how it's coming along. It was only 8 days ago that we checked in here last to give this system its last feeding, most recent feeding, and even then we had acknowledged that we're going to probably be checking in here a little earlier than it would be absolutely necessary after only 8 days, because we knew today its 200th birthday was on the horizon. What we fed on here is we had just laid out a nice fresh newly inserted piece of cardboard into which I had placed a whole bunch of holes. I don't know if you could start seeing some of the holes that I punched in here. And on top of the cardboard, I sprinkled a whole bunch of our new feeding item that I've started phasing in recently, which is the worm chow. And it's pulverized seeds, pulverized grains, and it looks like even if the worms haven't taken much of a shine to it quite yet, it does look like the mold has. Because I don't think all this white that I'm seeing on top is its natural color. It's a little more yellowish when you add it into the system, so it's at least starting to show some signs of wear in the form of fungus growing on it. I was also very curious to see what kind of progress gets made on this underlying piece of cardboard. It wasn't quite what I was expecting, that white-ish color on the bottom. I don't know if that's also some form of mold possibly growing on the cardboard bottom side. Weird. You know what this is? This is a tea bag. We had collected up a number of items and placed them right beneath this freshly inserted new piece of cardboard. There was all kinds of little pieces of scraps that we were able to collect up, so some of these tea bags were further along than others in the breakdown process. So we figured we would kind of put those down into an initial layer, like what do we call it? An appetizer layer? So that they can come up for that and start nibbling away on that little first portion of worm chow and some of these leftover bits of bedding that we placed right beneath the cardboard, and then they can come up to the top of the cardboard to feed on the worm chow that was placed out on top of the cardboard. So there's a good number of worms hanging out here. We did think that, putting in a feeding of dry foods as well as a brand new piece of cardboard, a pretty large one for that matter, that was all being put in here dry, that we'd absorb a little bit of the moisture within the system, because it did seem a little bit more damp in here than we would want it to be. Although the dampness is probably a beneficial thing in here to allow the worms to continue working down any residual bits of leftover food or bedding that might be in here. So I'm not objecting to the moisture, but on the other end of the spectrum, I also would like to see the stuff air out a little bit and possibly become a little bit drier and crumblier. Although you got to admit, it does look pretty crumbly down here. Even the stuff I pull up from the very bottom is pretty crumbly. Why don't we just give this whole system a quick till? And I first thought when I peeked in here, seeing all that leftover food on that covering piece of cardboard, it almost seemed like, hey, putting more food in here does not seem necessary. But if I do make this 20th feeding now, its final feeding at day 200, it would definitely be putting it into being a much older bin, still receiving active feedings on a regular basis than most of my systems. And not only that, to be able to make it to a 20th feeding, well, at least recently in my wormery, it's kind of uncommon. And it does seem to me like transitioning this bin to foraging is a good idea. And it probably won't go that route for very long either, you know, because usually the objective of foraging is to give the worms a chance to break down any residual bits of stuff in the material. And I know that the main culprit, I don't know if culprit is the right word, but the main thing that I would like to see, you know, happen in the process of foraging is that they turn their attention to the breakdown of these little leaves of, not leaves, the stems of leaves, which are still pretty prevalent in here. So I'd really like to see that stuff all broken down. If I see no more leaf stems like that, I would have to consider the castings as pretty much at that maturity stage that I like to see. So I'll probably continue covering with the plastic the way it had been. It was deliberately cinched in from the edges so that it would allow for a little bit of moisture loss through evaporation to occur out on those outer edges. Anything inboard of the plastic would probably continue to hang on to its moisture pretty good. But it also does seem to me like I wouldn't feel like it would be necessary to address moisture in this bin at this stage anymore, even though that was my sense of it previously. At this point, I'm starting to feel like possibly enough drying has already occurred in here that that crumbly and, you know, texture is starting to prevail, even though there's little lumpy, clumpy bits in here, possibly signs of a bit more moisture than is needed. I'd rather for it to be a little bit on that side, since we're not quite done here yet. So the moisture will be needed to support the ongoing foraging process, which will happen in here for a little while after we give it its last feeding, and for that reason I'm not going to be removing the plastic coverings. We'll be continuing to use them. Now here was my idea. My idea was to actually put this in upside down now, so that all of those grains that had been placed in here previously during the last feeding are now directly accessible to anybody coming up from below who wants to take a little nibble on it. There it is. And then as backup to that feeding, it'll be its final feeding. It'll be just another coating of worm chow across the top in a similar quantity as we applied 8 days ago, I believe. Seems like a good amount, especially since it's the last feeding we intend to give these little guys. I don't know, my compulsive nature wants to try to level this thing off. It doesn't feel quite level. It feels like it's a little bit higher over here in this corner, so whatever. Let's leave it at that. So you know, at this point my only missing link is the careful application, I guess, of this BTI. It is actually not about the water or the liquid, I believe. I believe it's about the bacteria that dissolves out of those little circular cookie cakes into the water. So I don't even know how much water can be assumed to be sufficient to bring enough of this bacteria into the system. But I think by doing it just the way we did it here, by sprinkling it right onto this cardboard, it pretty much soaked right in. So it didn't really go down into the bedding, so I don't think we're dampening the system much, if any, by applying it this way, so that's cool. I guess the added benefit is that it's going to just moisten this worm chow a little bit, making it a bit different from the way it was applied last time, which was put in here dry, right on top of a piece of dry cardboard. So it probably didn't get much worm action for a little while, at least in the beginning, but it did seem like the worms were beginning to take a shine to it. So I think last time we may have included some grit into here, which I'm not going to bother with today. It does look like a couple of these pumpkin seeds survived the the blender when I was making the worm chow, but rather than putting them back in here, I'm going to just include them with my supply of these seeds, because I've got more to grind up at some point once I start running low. So at some point in the future, my future recipe for this worm chow will continue to include pumpkin seeds. But I think we're done here. So 200 days, system looks really good. I feel with a good large chunk of cardboard like this placed in here for them to be able to nibble on at any time. They've got a sufficient supply of bedding and carbon food source, and even a little place to hang out in between the layers, which we didn't really explore too much, which may have been a mistake, because those couple peeks we took into separated layers, we find little worms hanging out in there. So even giving them a little bit of a fort to hang out inside of, a little place to go hide out in and have fun in. So that's it for our 200th day African nightcrawler system. I like the way the material has transformed into something that doesn't seem overly damp anymore, something that seems to crumble quite readily. No matter where we took a handful of the material from, we found that to be pretty much the consistent texture of it throughout. So I think this stuff's going to become really easy to harvest at some point, or at least I don't know if harvest is the right word, but we'll be able to screen through it pretty readily, I believe. And a lot of times, even after we separate the worms, we'll hang on to the finished castings for a little while longer before using it in the gardens, because of the assumption that there's still cocoons littering the material, even though all the adult worms have been removed and there's no more creation of new cocoons. It's all the existing cocoons that you would want to oftentimes allow a little extra time for, so that they can also hatch and the babies can be rounded up before the castings get used for gardening. So that's it for today's check-in with the African night crawlers for their, I believe, final feeding. 20 feedings, pretty good amount of material in this system. Planting season's coming up. Probably a good idea to start thinking about giving these guys a new home to play in anyway, right? All right, everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.